is for a man who needs no introduction, Michael Burlingame.
And I would like to start by acknowledging that I intend to observe Woodrow Wilson's advice for after-dinner speakers. It's known as the 3 B's. Be brief, be bold, and be gone. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you some adventures and misadventures that I had in writing that book. In general, my writings, even for my first book. The first book I wrote was called The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, which I wanted to call Shrinkin' Lincoln, but my publisher, the University of Illinois Press, didn't like that idea. So anyway, and it was inspired by Chuck Strozier, who was a professor of history at Sangamon State, now University of Illinois Springfield. And it's a psychological biography of Lincoln by Strozier. And I read it and I was quite fascinated. And I thought, there's really some good insights here, but I think I have some that I could add to it. And so I said to myself, I don't think I can add anything new, factually, to the Lincoln record, but I can add some psychological insights into various aspects of Lincoln's career and history that Strozier overlooked, or I think could be expanded upon. For example, why did Lincoln hate slavery so much? And I argue that it was partly because his father treated him like a slave. He'd rent him out, and then all the money he made would be turned over to his father. And then when Lincoln denounced slavery, he denounced it as an outrage that somebody goes out and works in the hot sun all day and somebody else derives all the profits. And so then I wrote about his marriage and how unhappy that marriage was, in part because of his own personality. Unlike every other man you've ever heard of, Lincoln was emotionally reserved and uncommunicative. Let me repeat that. Unlike every other man you've ever heard of, he was emotionally reserved and uncommunicative. And his relationships with his children, his midlife crisis. In his 20s and his 30s, he was something of a low-road politician who specialized in sarcasm and ridicule of Democrats. And then in his 40s and 50s, he was a high-road politician, not low-road, who appealed to the better angels of our nature. And in between those two stages, the low road and the high road, there was a 5-year break where he dropped out of politics. And I argue that he went through a very successful midlife crisis, that lots of men in their early 40s undergo a period of intense introspection in which they ask themselves, did I make the right career choice? Did I make the right marital choice? What do I want to leave as a legacy? What's truly important to me? Things of that sort. Now, Lincoln, unfortunately, didn't keep a diary, didn't write letters that illustrated what was going on internally. But you see what he looked like at age 40, low road. At 45, he's high road. So it seemed to me that he was a classic example of someone who had a very successful midlife crisis. And anyway, so I drafted the book based on published sources, because I didn't think, as I say, that there was anything new factually I could say about Abraham Lincoln. And so I was at Connecticut College, and a small liberal arts college in New London, and I used the library there and the interlibrary loan services and read the published literature pretty thoroughly, drafted the book, and then said, I really ought to do some research in unpublished sources. I'm a PhD in history. I did a doctoral dissertation. I know what it's like to do original research. But it was a small liberal arts college where you weren't expected to do research in those days. And you taught a lot of courses and the like. And I thought, well, still, I feel this urge to do this book based on what I read in Chuck Strozier. And then, so the first day that I went out to do research in unpublished sources, that is, diaries and manuscripts and letters and incoming mail and book and speech drafts and that sort of thing. And the nearest place to do that research, if you were based in New London, Connecticut, was Providence, Rhode Island, about an hour away, at the John Hay Library at Brown University. And if you can't be out here at Springfield doing Lincoln research, or in Washington, D.C., that's the best place in the country to do Lincoln research. It's an astounding collection that they have there. And on the first day I went to Brown, I had a very sophisticated research design. I went to the card catalog and looked at the drawer L and pulled it out and went through all these 3x5 cards. And all of a sudden I ran into all these interviews that Nicolay, who was Lincoln's personal secretary, primary principal secretary in the White House, had done 10 years. He'd come out here to Springfield and then in Washington and interviewed people who had not been interviewed by William Herndon. And I was just astounded. This is brand new information. A lot of it very important. I thought to myself, heavens. And Nicolay and Hay didn't incorporate these interviews into their 10-volume history, 10 volumes, mind you, of Abraham Lincoln. And but the Green Monster seems like a pamphlet in comparison, right? That's because they had access, exclusive access to the personal papers of Lincoln. Nicolay and Hay were good buddies with Robert Lincoln, and therefore Robert Lincoln gave those two men exclusive control over those papers. And they said that people's memories play tricks on them. You can't rely on reminiscences because, as Mark Twain once said, the older I get, the more vividly I remember things that never happened. So anyway, so I saw this. I was astounded. And then I thought to myself, these are the research notes for the big Nicolay Hay biography. And I bet you that some of the early biographers in the late 19th century and the early 20th century actually went out and did what Nicolay did and interviewed people who knew Lincoln. And they have research notes that didn't, and many of those research notes, based on the interviews with people who had known Lincoln, don't show up in their books because the publishers are always saying, compact that snowball, cut it down. Johns Hopkins University Press was merciless in confining me to 2,000 pages. In any event, and so I went out and looked at the research notes of a lot of the early biographers. I spent a couple of weeks in Meadville, Pennsylvania, going through the papers of Ida Tarbell, who's best remembered for her muckraking study of Standard Oil, but she did an important Lincoln biography at the end of the 19th century. And she did a lot of interviewing, and she had people out here in Springfield doing interviewing for her and in Indiana doing, and these are research notes, and a lot of this stuff doesn't show up in her books. I thought, well, this is great. And then I went to the Library of Congress, and there were the Albert J. Beveridge papers. And Beveridge had written 2 fat volumes. Mine are magisterial, his were fat. He had a lot of correspondence with people who had known Lincoln, or whose parents had known Lincoln. And Josh, I think you can testify that there's a lot of good information in those letters. Then I went to look at the William E. Barton papers at the University of Chicago. Wonderful correspondence with all kinds of new information. And then the Sandberg papers. I go over to the University of Illinois campus, that satellite campus over in Champaign-Urbana. There's all kinds of good stuff there. I thought that one of the things that I would share with you is an excerpt from one of the interviews that Nicolay had conducted with a Pennsylvania politician who had come out here to Springfield in January of 1861, after Lincoln had won the election, to lobby on behalf of a Pennsylvania politico, Simon Cameron, to serve in the cabinet. And this gentleman was interviewed by Nicolay and told Nicolay, well, Lincoln wasn't very receptive to the idea. And he said to me, Lincoln did, I have just been elected president because my friends have marketed me as Honest Old Abe. And I have won my election largely on that reputation. Now, how can I, as my first public act, appoint to my cabinet a man whose reputation for corruption stinks in the nostrils of the American public? Like, whoa, there's a nice, powerful Lincoln quote, except it was very hard to read because Nicolay had written out in longhand all the interview except that quote, which was in a shorthand, a peculiar shorthand. And I thought, I guess Nicolay felt that this was too embarrassing to really put, and so I couldn't read it. But luckily it was at the Library of Congress and there was somebody there who could do it. And so I was able to rescue this. So all kinds of things kept turning up in these collections of people's research notes. I was thrilled. And so one of the things I've done since then is to do a lot of compilations of Lincoln primary source materials that I've discovered in these collections. And in some ways, I'm still a 19-year-old undergraduate at Princeton when I was hired by David Donald to be his research assistant for Charles Sumner, Volume 2. And then another striking discovery was newspapers. Now, this is before the magnificent databases that we now have of newspapers.com and Ancestry and Genealogy Bank. And almost all historians had just used New York newspapers because they had the biggest budgets and the biggest staffs and all that. But if you look at the papers from Ohio and Indiana and Springfield and the like, you find all kinds of information that doesn't show up in the New York papers. And so I thought, well, my goodness, this is striking, it's really exciting. And I would sit for hours in front of a microfilm reader and turning the crank. And I might come back with 2 notes, but they were actual Lincoln quotes or paraphrases of Lincoln's. And it's a little bit, Griff, like what you experience. You put in a lot of work and then you find some really good stuff. So anyway, it was so exciting that I really have been carried away in doing compilations of Lincoln primary source materials that I've discovered in unfamiliar, off the beaten track places like Providence, Rhode Island. Okay, so that's adventure. Now for a misadventure. I'd like to describe an event that took place many years ago in the New York Public Library. There's this magnificent reading room. It's as big as a football field. It's 300 feet long. 50-foot ceilings, magnificent desks, wooden, beautiful desks. And I had ordered a series of reminiscences of Lincoln by people who'd known him and obscure journals and pamphlets and the like. And I was sitting at the desk, and the reading room was full. Every desk was full. And there were people to my right, people to my left, people behind me, people in front of me. And I start to go through these reminiscences, and when you do research in sources of this sort, you're bound to find funny stories that Lincoln tells. And so about a half hour into my research that day, I encounter a funny story, and without thinking where I was, I involuntarily burst out laughing, right in the middle of the New York Public Library reading room. And everybody goes, shh, shh, shh. My God. So I'm an uptight wasp. I don't like to offend people. And so I said, oh, forgive me, I'll behave. So I go back to my work, and another half hour passes or so, and once again, another funny story comes into my ken, and involuntarily, without thinking about it, I burst out laughing again. And everybody around me goes, shh, a little more vehemently this time, and I apologize a little more abjectly this time. And I go back to my work. And lo and behold, it happens a third time. And the woman sitting directly across the table from me, a woman of roughly my vintage, and she's a very earnest-looking woman, did no makeup, hair in a tight bun, wire-rimmed glasses, and she's taking notes from a big sociology tome. And she leans over that desk, and she fixes me with her gaze, and she says, "Just what is your field, anyhow? I think I'm going to switch to it." So Now, I intend to write a memoir of my experiences as a Lincoln scholar, dating back to my freshman year in college. And I'm going to call it Lincoln's Slave. I'm told it will have a big sale among the daughters of the Confederacy. But to close, I would like to, in keeping with Woodrow Wilson's rules, just quote something from The Green Monster. This is the final paragraph of that book. I'm sure you all know it by heart, but just to jog your memory. And this will save you 1,600 pages of reading, actually. And here goes. Lincoln speaks to us not only as a champion of democracy, freedom, and national unity, but also as a source of inspiration. Few people will achieve his world historical importance, but many can profit from his personal example, encouraged by the knowledge that despite a childhood of emotional deprivation and grinding poverty, despite a lack of formal education, despite a series of career failures, despite a woe-filled marriage, despite a tendency to depression, despite a painful midlife crisis, despite the early death of his mother and his siblings, as well as of his sweetheart and 2 of his 4 children. He became a model of psychological maturity, moral clarity, and unimpeachable integrity. His presence and his leadership inspired his contemporaries. His life story can do the same for generations to come. I thank you for your attention.
One last matter to one last thing to attend to, which will come as a surprise to Michael. You might have heard of a person going way back in the LA by the name of Logan Hay. He was related to both Stephen Trigg Logan and to Milton and John Hay, and he led this organization into the level of scholarship which we now enjoy. And the award that we have for Michael is the Logan Hay Award.
Oh, my goodness.
Which is a complete surprise.
It is. I'm not worthy of this, really. This is for very special people.
No, well, the Logan Hay Award is reserved for people who have done extraordinary service on behalf of the Abraham Lincoln Association over many years, and there's no better person to receive this award tonight than you. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you.